Welcome, everybody who is joining this experimental session in which Matt O'Neill and myself, David Wood, will be facilitating a discussion via this LinkedIn functionality. It's an experimental format, but it's an incredibly important topic for reasons that I think are widely appreciated, but we may discover in our discussions reasons why it's even more important. So we'll be opening the discussion to guests shortly, but to kick things off, Matt O'Neill, who you can find online as Futurist Matt. He is going to set a few points down on the table for consideration. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, David. So I've just made a few notes that I think will hopefully give you some ideas and sort of show you kind of where the situation is right now. And I think we need to start off by defining what deepfakes are. And according to Wikipedia, they are synthetic media in which a person or existing image or video is replaced with someone else's likeness. Right. And I think this is a really important topic because I think what we're starting to see much more now is that AI is really coming to become a reality for people. You know, it's not just those backroom processes or making a decision on whether you get a mortgage or what the cost of your insurance are. And I think the deep fakes will be AI's first real punch against humanity. And so some examples would include things like child sex abuse materials, celebrity pornographic videos, fake news, bullying, financial fraud. And to get really practical, some of you might remember back in 2020, there was an anti-pornography campaigner called Kate Isaacs, and she led a campaign to have millions of videos removed from Pornhub. So it had, I think, 13 million at the time. She had 10 million removed on the grounds that a lot of people couldn't give consent or they were underage. And one of the real challenges there was that it made her a target. And some people were taking her face from the media interviews, they were creating pornography. And then to paraphrase the tweets, it was along the lines of she wanted to get rid of porn because she had a video she was ashamed of. And a lot of people believed it. She was bullied incessantly to the point that I think she even took her Twitter account down. More recently, if we look at what was happening in Ukraine back in March, an Ukrainian news website was hacked, and a video showing President Zelensky depicted was him telling soldiers to lay down their arms and surrender. And very quickly, it was taken down by the Western social media networks, but boosted on Russian social media. What a coincidence. And then even Meta, you know, they're saying that 2/3 of the influence operations that they found and closed down this year use computer-generated profile pictures. Looking into Wired magazine, one of my favorite tech magazines, they did a piece where journalists and human rights defenders are fearing having to constantly prove what's real and what's fake. And it's not just debunking rumor, but constantly proving authenticity. An example of this was the conspiracists who dismissed Trump's really awkward concession speak after the January 6th Capitol attack as being a deep fake. And then I think what it really comes down to, and this is backed up by Edelman, the global PR agency, every year they do something called their trust barometer, where they interview thousands of people around the world and ask them about their level of trust in government, business, non-profit, so on and so forth. And this year they showed that 46% of respondents, so 1 in 2, see media as a divisive force in society. And this is a really big one for me because, you know, I think anything that's fueling conspiratorial mindsets is just creating more division, and we certainly don't need more of that. So how are these deepfakes created? So you've got really 2 levels. You've got lower level app software, and some of you have probably had a bit of a play with it, and it's good fun, and you can get it on your smartphone, through to much more sophisticated creation tools, which would commonly be found, say, on open source, GitHub as a case in point, on the GitHub community. And these are capable of creating a lot more sophisticated output. So having created that output, I think what we need to think about is measuring the veracity of this content. So looking at whether it's true or not. And what you're finding on a technical level at the moment is two classifications of tools. So there's tools that examine the inauthenticity of content. An example of that would be the open source Deepware program. Challenge with that is it's very slow to process material and can take hours to examine content. And then you've got the different form of classification, which is examining authenticity. And it was only November this year that Intel released their fake capture software. And this takes a different approach because it looks for what makes us human. And this even gets down to looking into pixels on the face to look at blood flow in the face. And another aspect, I think, is they're looking at the correlation between breathing, chest movement, and what's being said. And it seems to be very successful. It's returning results with 96% accuracy and within milliseconds. And I find this something quite reassuring about the authentic approach, because in my mind, it's the equivalent of the myth that it takes more muscles to frown than it does to smile. And then on the human level, the basics for detection of this sort of stuff include things like facial discoloration, weird lighting, badly synced audio and video, blurriness where the face meets the neck and hair. And humans are very good at this, right? And I asked a friend of mine who happens to be an intergenerational leadership specialist. Some of you may have heard of her, Henry Rose Lee. And she made a really interesting point. She says that the evidence is showing that younger people are more likely to become victims of online scams and fraud. And so the question, I think, there is, whose job is it to help kids think about synthetic media more critically? Is it schools? Is it parents? Is it the kids themselves? And then thinking about the evolution of the technology. So what we're seeing is the tech is getting a lot more advanced. I think anyone who's working in user experience here has probably come across the term simplexity. Sounds horribly pretentious, but is actually a legitimate word, I would say. It describes how we have very simple to use interfaces that sit on top of very complex underlying systems. So in short, I think we're going to get higher quality, harder to detect deepfake media. And then the question there is, if any story, audio, image, video can be fake and high quality, then nothing has to be real. So how are the authorities responding to it at the moment? So interestingly, China is quite pioneering here. So their Cyberspace Administration Division expects, and I'm using the quotes here, synthetic humans to be widely used. And they're saying deepfakes must be labeled as such. And of course, this is all about their so-called national interest and Communist Party values. So what they're saying is that these deep synthesis providers need to be regulated. In the EU, we're just starting to see the Digital Services Act being expanded a little bit to help tackle deepfakes. But the challenge here is that it's still a voluntary code that revolves around co-regulation between regulators and signatories. So, if you're the signatories being sort of the Googles, the Facebooks, the Twitter. And on the harshest penalty, that could theoretically mean fines of up to 6% of their global turnover. I don't think we've seen anything quite like that so far, though. And then in the UK, we already have a law banning so-called upskirt photography, but there's still a loophole because it didn't tackle the images that aren't a victim's genitals or buttocks. And the leader of the House of Commons at the moment, Penny Mordaunt, she's leading a lot of debate about criminalising deepfake video. So I think what's interesting is that's how some of the governments are tackling it. I think we do have, a cybersecurity expert in the meeting at the moment. So I'm going to suggest that jobs always arise because we have problems, right? So if deepfakes are a problem, then perhaps we're going to see a new class of job, the deepfake forensic expert. And clearly that there'll be some expansion of related jobs in cybersecurity. And I just want to leave on a positive view because it's all a bit negative. The flip side of this, I think, is that as we get these really sophisticated video creation tools coming through, I think it's going to see a massive unleashing of creativity and raw talent. So if you're a great storyteller, but maybe you don't have access to a resource like cameras and teams to create films, I think these types of software, as they advance, will enable a completely new form of filmmaking, perhaps even decentralizing aspects of the film industry. So just a few notes there, I think, just to hopefully spark off some ideas for the discussion. David.
Many thanks, Matt. So shortly, we will encourage audience members to indicate if they want to speak. Before that, I've got a few thoughts of my own to put into the discussion. Some people are saying that we're getting worked up unnecessarily here. We shouldn't be panicking. There's nothing essentially new with fake news. There has always been forgeries. There were forgeries of paintings by great masters, forgeries of secure communications and diplomatic cables, Forgery was submitted as evidence in criminal trials that led to false convictions. More recently, we've had many decades of Paint Shop Pro, manipulation of images. Now, of course, there's AI, but since we've adjusted to fake news in the past, we're going to adjust to it again. But I don't agree with that analysis. I think there's 5 reasons why it's different this time around. First, the pace of change in the tools. New methods are becoming available all the time. So even before we've got used to a method of fakery, there's a new method to distort and deceive. Secondly, you don't need to be an expert to use these tools. You needed to be pretty good at art to forge a painting and pretend it was by Michelangelo or Rembrandt. But methods are available now where a very ordinary person, with some enthusiasm, with some keenness, can produce very impressive fakes. Third, when fake news is available and created, it can spread in multiple ways because we're networked together in unprecedented ways. And so we just need a few of these messages to take off in a viral way, and everybody's head will be spinning for the wrong reasons. Fourth, there's another aspect to which our networks are more dangerous these days, and that is that there used to be gatekeepers that prevented or checked what kind of news was going on their network. So in the olden days, when news was distributed by newspapers, most newspaper editorial teams had a sense of responsibility. If some weird story turned up, it was funny, but it poked some abuse at somebody in public, they would check it out before it got published. They wouldn't just go on the whim because, hey, this is going to boost circulation. There was a greater sense of responsibility. And many news media organizations still try to operate by that principle, but there are many others that position themselves partly as entertainment, partly as propaganda, and they don't check these things at all. So news which probably should have been filtered out gets in and is distributed everywhere, and once peripheral news organizations are reporting it, others will pick it up as well. And then last, there's the consequences. If people are riled or pushed into some state of anger and tribal hostility because of fake news, there are more weapons at people's hands now than before. Of course, angry people could always do bad things, but it's much easier to get a hold of automatic weaponry. It's much easier to go and hack things. So the potential deadliness of fake news could be more significant. So what can be done about it? Well, I'll be very interested in comments from the community that's here, a lot of very thoughtful, intelligent people, but I will offer a few thoughts. Of course, we need to flip our own attitudes. Each of us needs to learn that we have to check and ask questions and be vigilant about information that comes our way. But we can't be in a state of permanent paranoia. That's frankly bad for our mental state. So we need to constantly check out what are reliable tools, what are helpful systems that can speak up on our behalf, that can intervene. We already have it. Sometimes before we click on an email, the email software intercepts us and says, be careful, don't click on this. It is similar to how other mails caught people out in the past and caused all kinds of problems. So our tools are there to be used, and we have to constantly learn which tools are up to date, which tools might be compromised. So this change of attitude, which I think we all need to adopt and encourage in others, it can be coupled with a change of broader attitude, which is we need to encourage people to flip from being preaching or prosecuting. Preaching is when you're sure you know what's true. Prosecuting is when you're sure somebody else is wrong. We have to flip people into more of a scientific frame of mind more often, where we are inclined to search not just for confirmation, but searching for disconfirmation, searching out alternative points of view that might show that this piece of news which has landed in our lap, which seems very juicy and so funny and so good to get our hands around, we have to be more inclined to check it out and prod at it before we get involved ourselves in passing it along. The third thing is I see a rise in the importance of organizations and sites that can be trusted with their handling of the news. There are some media which are pretty reliable most of the time. I think of the BBC, there are others. I think more generally that companies and organizations that can prove themselves to be trustworthy in their handling of data, they will be the winners in the 2020s, much as it was the companies and organizations who put a focus on usability of technology that were the winners in the last few decades. It's not just technology with lots of functionality, it was technology with good usability. And now I think I hope that the winners in the next decade or so are going to be organizations that can truly prove that they are trustworthy. And finally, I think we do need to have legal support as well. There should be waves of legislation, and I use that word with some caution because I know legislation can backfire, especially when it's in the hands of dangerous autocratic governments. But we have already some legislation that prevents what people can say in adverts. It prevents people making false claims in adverts, and companies can have severe financial penalties for making false claims. Companies also can have severe financial penalties when in their own financial reporting they are making dangerous or wrong claims, or when price-sensitive information is leaked prematurely to just a subset of potential shareholders. So there are limits already, and I think we need more of them. It's not something we should rush into. It's something there should be a lot of discussion about. We should see the drawbacks to all legislation, but I think we need to have that discussion as a very serious point. And as much energy, as much intelligence needs to go into that discussion as goes into the creation of the technology in the first place. So these are my opening remarks. Matt, back to you.
Well, I think we've had our first person who's asking to speak. It's Shalini someone. I'm going to put you on, Shalini, so let's hear what you've got to say. Yeah, you're on. You need to unmute yourself.
You need to unmute yourself. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So thank you so much. But Matt, in knowing human behavior, people are lazy. People are not going to do counterfactual checks. So what do you think about that? Because we want frictionless worlds, right?
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think this idea that amateurs need to become sort of have critical thinking to look at deep fakes. I mean, it just seems ludicrous. It seems obvious to me that the solution has to be technical. And, when you look at these tools like Fake Catcher from Intel, I hope that these sorts of tools will just be worked into the platforms. And before a video goes live, then it gets processed. And if it doesn't pass with a good margin of error, it's just not allowed up.
I think we need.
But then we need to trust Intel or whatever firm, which hasn't had a good rap in terms of Google and Facebook. Yeah.
I couldn't comment on that. David, have you got a comment on that?
You're entirely correct, Professor Gopal Krishnan. We have questions over whether these intermediate companies, the companies who are providing these tools, who are doing these checks, whether they are truly on the side of the users or whether they are partially, at least, on their own side. And every time a search engine highlights some information as more attractive than others, they're not always doing that for our sake as the end user. They are sometimes conflicted. It's because they want to promote their own products or products for which they will earn more revenue. So we have to challenge these third parties who are doing this. But I think they can step up, and some of them may become more trusted. There is generally a reasonable degree of trust in Wikipedia, for example. There is trust in some other organizations, and we must figure out which can be trusted, and we must encourage them, but also keep an eye on them. There must always be people watching the watchers or supervising the supervisors, as it were. Back to whether people are lazy. Well, yes, we all are lazy, but I think we can all be encouraged to carry out some checks. I think all people can be helped to take more account. We can all be taught, don't just trust what you see. There are visual illusions. People can be taught if an email is too good to be true, it probably is too good and isn't true. So we must figure out how we can bring more people up to date. Once upon a time, it was felt, hey, elderly users of IT are always going to be vulnerable to deception. But it turns out there are ways in which we can explain it to elderly users, grandparents, and so on, and others from all educational backgrounds. We can gradually help them to be more vigilant. So I think we need both. We need the tools and the channels to get better, but we also can look to generally more vigilant participants too.
Something that slightly concerns me, David, is having worked in China quite a few times actually, when you see sort of how could you call it an internet? I suppose just about. When you see how it operates and how restrictive it is, one of the things that concerns me is that could governments kind of overreact and they start to say, well, we are outlawing certain types of website because they have a risk that they might show faked media. And so this is something I've seen it in China, when you can't even access your basic services. And I wonder if there's a danger that regulation could become too tough, or indeed if the penalties for the social networks allowing this type of media are so severe, then they might restrict content that actually isn't fake at all, just because they're too worried about some sort of financial penalty.
So my view is this is a hard problem, but it's an important problem. And yes, we can point to many countries in the world which are censoring the internet. They claim they're keeping out fake news when they're just keeping out news that's embarrassing for them or troublesome for them. And we must not emulate that. But there can be some objective measures, and I think we should build on that. There are things that we should disallow. People pretending to be somebody they are not, that should be penalized. If somebody pretends to be Barack Obama and makes a speech where sounds like Barack Obama and isn't and causes trouble, that is definitely wrong in any political color. And likewise, when somebody pretends to be Pope Francis or Donald Trump or Greta Thunberg or whoever. So there are, I think, some grounds in which we can move forward, but as I said, we have to watch the watchers and be vigilant about the surveillance groups.
By the way, everyone, do feel free. Sorry.
Yeah, the last thing. Thank you. I'm a teacher. I have taught every grade from kindergarten through doctorate. And I find people do not want to spend the efforts to really think like you're saying. And I agree with Matt and David, people really need to start for their own survival. We are trying tons and tons of different things, but I don't have too much hope from education. But thank you so much for hosting this. I'll get out now.
I'm reminded of the statement by Winston Churchill, which is actually a fake quote. His family say he never expressed it, but it has been attributed that the best argument against democracy is a 10-minute conversation with the average voter. That when you, quote, meet an average person and talk with them, you will discover that they are in many ways very ignorant and they don't understand many of the things going on, and you might be horrified and you might not want to let them vote. But as I've said, Winston Churchill's family have argued that he never said such a thing, and there is evidence that his view instead, which I share, is that many so-called average voters, given the opportunity, can be very thoughtful and intelligent when it comes to making decisions. We've just got to be sure that the conversation involves them and doesn't preach down to them. So I am more hopeful that with the right circumstances, more people will play a more active role in keeping the internet safe for all of us. But I don't expect it to happen overnight.
David, we got Carrie who's asking to speak, so I'm going to admit her. Right, Carrie, you should be on momentarily. There you are. Thank you, Shalini.
Evening, folks. This is very interesting, isn't it? It's my first live audio LinkedIn, so thank you for the experience of that as well. I was just trying to sort of formulate my thoughts because I think there's a lot going on here, and we've already picked out a few different elements. I think that question of sort of who gets to arbitrate and who decides what's the truth or otherwise, and what structures are in place to support that. And obviously, it takes a long time to build trust, and it can be knocked down really quickly. So I think there are interesting things there. I wonder if actually, rather than talking about some of the more extreme examples of where people are purposely misleading big parts of society, do you feel, from what you know, either of our speakers or anyone else in the audience, in terms of those sort of more day-to-day impacts of this, the slightly more insidious things? I had a friend the other day posting on talking about ChatGPT and had asked it to produce a 1-hour lesson plan on kindness, and it was actually a really good result. But again, how much do we need to know what's come from a person or what's come from a machine?
Yeah, very interesting. David, just a very quick one from me. Something that I read, and I can't back this up necessarily. Apparently, Google either are or are about to ban ChatGPT results, or they're about to. No, sorry, they're about to label them as spam. Maybe someone else can verify that, but something that I read earlier this week.
I haven't heard that. What I have heard is that one of the programmer exchange websites, Stack Exchange, said they couldn't accept answers from ChatGPT because although they might look correct, they might look confident, they were in many cases wrong. So that should be taken more carefully. Now, that decision may be revised in due course. As for whether information should be highlighted as being created by an AI, I am fully on the view that all information created by an AI should be indicated as such. It gets more complicated, of course, when it's a joint thing. You might type something into a chatbot, it may give you an initial idea, and then you might take that idea and rework it and make it your own. So at the end, you might say, some initial ideas came from such and such a source. But I think people need to be alerted, certainly when things are not from where they seem to be. If it's a parody, it should be clear that it's a parody. And if it is straight from an AI, then that should be indicated as well. That's my view, but likely it's going to become more nuanced as we see more complicated real-world cases, which means we've got to be ready to update the principles and legislation pretty quickly. We're going to have to move into a more agile response mode.
Carrie, is there anything you want to extend before I let Nicolina in?
I think it was just, again, I think it's really, really interesting. I do wonder whether our thinking will change. And actually, you know, as things, there was an article I was reading the other day about how a lot of modern music follows a sort of set pattern and algorithms, and you get less of the surprises at the bridge, and the key changes are all a little bit as expected. I wonder if actually, in terms of our understanding of the world and the levels of quality we expect from different things will shift. And so we will just start to have this almost mass-produced content, and we understand it's mass-produced, but we use it anyway, in the same way as we do with so many other things in our lives. But yeah, really interesting topic. Thank you so much.
My view on that is that, yes, there will be some similarities, but then people will say, hey, let's try something different. And so there will be waves, a bit like fashions, in which there are brand new ideas, in which there are these exciting key changes and variations again, because the tools will not stay static. The tools will continually evolve, and people's interest in the tools will evolve fast as well.
Hi.
Hello, good evening. Hi, Matt. Hi, David. It strikes me that at the heart of this particular issue, the deepfake issue, is the issue of the source of the information. And that to rely on AI versus AI to regulate is a dangerous path, because we're then into the territory of who has the best AI. So some form of verifying the source, of certification, would seem to be a sensible route. Whether such a thing could be agreed internationally or otherwise, whether it could be ledger based, so traceable. But I think that for me would be how I would most like to disseminate my information, is knowing what the source was. And even if a source is AI generated through ChatGPT or some other medium, that a human being is ultimately responsible for its dissemination, for its release into the ether, and is therefore personally or corporately responsible for that information circulating. A form of certification would also give an easy mechanism for a lot of social media to block non-certified content. So suddenly, if you have a foreign government trying to destabilize another government, issuing a huge amount of deepfake material into the ether, if that material isn't certified, source certified, then it simply doesn't get air. The oxygen is cut off at point of source almost, with the exception of their own networks under their own control. So I think rather than, obviously AI tools to combat deepfake AI are to be welcomed, in the same way as YouTube having a block on copyrighted content, for example. But I do think that some kind of international method of verifying source is becoming ever more important. Even down to fact checking certain US documentaries that have been released recently, and the kind of US EU reaction to that. So I won't labour the point, but that for me, the source of the information for me is always important, and not just who vetted it, but who the original source was.
Challenge I've got with that, Ian, is like how do you do that at scale? And so, if you think YouTube already monitors for things like whether there's copyrighted music being used, and that's done in an automated way. But it strikes me it would be extremely labour intensive to do that at a human scale. Question mark.
I was thinking more of kind of Web3 blockchain ledger technology.
Okay.
And I'm not bandying the word blockchain around loosely.
So
David?
I'm very interested to see what this system would involve. I like the idea that we could somehow inspect information and figure out with confidence where it had come from. And so we could see, this has got the spark of truth or the spark of reliability built into it. So how that would work.
I remember an episode of Star Trek, Next Generation, some years ago, when they were talking about the fact that their society had no money, and the non-human gentleman talking to them said, "Well, how do you what's your medium for exchange then?" And Riker said, "Reputation." And so I'm wondering whether there's some basis for you as an individual or you as a corporate entity gaining credibility and gaining reputation over time. It might be a bit too far out there, but it certainly would be one way of combating. If you, as you say, if you know it's from the BBC, you know it's reasonably fact checked and reasonably balanced. If you know it's from David Wood, it's been pondered, it's been thought about, and it hasn't been released without due consideration. And so there may be almost a hierarchy of sort of, as there is in the real world, of who you trust and who you don't trust as source for your information. But I think the key thing is knowing what the source of the information is, because at the moment, half the problem is that somebody can create a deep fake, release it into the ether, it goes viral, and you never know where it came from, in order to try and track it back or stop it or fact check it. So I think having some mechanism to stamp in the way we stamp an image, to stamp a file with an identifier that is traceable, and I won't take it any further than that because I don't want to hold the mic, would be an interesting line of inquiry.
Well, I'm going to give a thumbs up to that whole line of inquiry, recognizing there will be difficulties. Something might originate from the BBC, somebody else might summarize it, and whether that summary is a fair summary or distorts it that's a question. And somebody might quote me, and you said that I generally ponder what I say, but I might have said something off the top of my head on a subject that I know little about. So, to
But
when should people be trusted and when not? But I don't think that's the end of the discussion. I think that's all just something to be worked out.
one last very, very quick point. If I summarize what you say, David, and I then put that out into the ether, I'm the author, even though I'm drawing on your material. But I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Nicolina, so perhaps you'd
Hello,
like to
hello everyone. I wanted to answer firstly to Carrie when she asked about a perhaps closer example of fake news, and I think Ian and David have pretty much covered the aspect of news we read online having a bigger chance of being AI written or modeled rather than being written by a human from start to finish. But there is also, as everything on internet has its dark side, it seems, there is also a malicious version of using deepfake videos, especially against people who are especially vulnerable in that aspect. For example, enormous sites such as Pornhub has used awful deepfake tactics in an attempt to silence numerous protesters against violence and everything, and the videos they were hosting in general. And even though that is one interesting article I read, hopefully humanly written, that the main fighter in this years-long battle to remove the videos had 15 to 20 deepfake videos about her created, but 2 million videos were deleted. So it's a win, but she did have to suffer a lot through it all.
Thanks, Nicolina. Chris, you were next.
Hi, folks. Yeah, very interesting conversation. One of the things that struck me with some of the solutions that we're banding about, the opportunity to be anonymous online is actually very powerful for a lot of people. You want to discuss mental health issues. You don't want to be identified. You want to seek help. So tagging everything with a source is perhaps a little bit too detrimental. The reputation idea is kind of interesting, but didn't China try that with a social media, a social score for online participation? So I saw a couple of news articles about that, and perhaps you guys could correct me because I'm sure you might have looked at that as well. But it seems a little bit draconian to go down all of that path. I do think that when we look at deep fakes, image, video, text, there is a point coming where we might just have to accept that they're going to be indistinguishable from the original, from an original item. There's no way to tell the difference. It just is. And in that case, I do think there's a certain correlation to knowing where these sources come from and reputable news sites. But then you get into this very difficult world of, well, how do you approve a news site or a news source as being trustworthy? And as soon as the legislation gets involved in that, well, then you've got state-controlled media. And then is that really the right way to go? So it is a very difficult situation. I don't have a solution, but I have some concerns about the potential overregulation that might result from it.
I agree.
I give a thumbs up to importance of anonymous. I agree there are certainly cases when it makes sense, and it's important indeed for people to be able to raise things in an anonymous way. How we avoid that being abused is a challenge, and people have started to think about it. So there needs to be some evidence there's a real human being there, who is representing broadly what he or she says they are representing, even though they are anonymous. So some work needs to be done. In terms of the drawbacks of the social media score system used in China, I agree there are ways in which it is working which are worrying, but it doesn't mean we should give up on all methods to try and assess reputation and manage reputation. There are many online systems, such as on Reddit, on Less Wrong, and elsewhere, where people have various karma or reputation assigned to them on account of people giving thumbs up to the comments they have made. It's not a foolproof system, but it sort of puts in place something akin to what we do in real life anyway. So just because the Chinese system hasn't worked or doesn't meet all our expectations so far doesn't mean the whole idea should be given up. It needs more thought, which is why we're having this meeting. And finally, if I can circle back to the point that Nicolina made, what I would take from that is we need to be quite clear what are the kinds of outcomes from distorted media that we most should try to avoid. What are the bad, truly bad outcomes, so that it changes from just being an abstract discussion into something in which we can say, here's an outcome which clearly was bad, and we need a system to avoid or reduce the risks of that happening again. So that's one outcome of this. In due course, there should be a clearer clarification of what are the bad outcomes and also what are the good outcomes that we can look forward to.
Yeah, I think let's hear from Niklas. I hope I pronounced your name right, Niklas.
Oh, that's almost correct. Niklas from Sweden. Thanks a lot for this discussion. I really enjoyed, because I've been looking for this kind of discussion for quite a long time. For 2 years ago, I discovered something called the International Initiative on Information and Democracy. I'm not sure if you've heard about that, but I think it's based by Reporters Without Borders, and they initiated a report which have a lot of policy suggestions based on how we try to control this kind of fake media, and how do we stop informatics, which is their kind of wording for this. They have a lot of proposals, but both on how we should allow research on the big tech's algorithm, how we should make alarm systems, like it was used in some areas where Facebook was the base for starting up riots, and how we could try to force the big tech companies to give information to our governments, and also be able to stop it through laws and similar things. But I'm not sure, has any of you heard about this? Because I think it's quite important, but I tried to raise this question in Sweden, but there is very few people who knows about, although this is quite a big international network of people and organizations.
So that's Democracy Without Borders and the International Initiative on, I tried to make notes, but I didn't catch it.
It's International Initiative on Information and Democracy. Well,
I want to look more into that. I want to find out what they're saying and possibly host them on a forthcoming London Futurist event.
Yeah, thank you. Nick, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi both. Hello all. Really interesting, obviously, and sort of quite challenging. David, you made some comments on sort of corporate culpability in your opening remarks, and Ian mentioned sort of the role of corporate entities as well, and we've talked about sort of the government role. And this is going to sound sort of terrible before it sounds better. I don't think governments are remotely equipped, and frankly, probably shouldn't be, to be the answer to this. And you see this at the moment. If we look at today's environment, we have scammers in different jurisdictions we can't even reach, or just the grim sort of bun fight of Twitter. So digital crime is everywhere, and no police resource is properly equipped to protect ordinary people at the moment. The cleanup rate on digital crime is minuscule. So the sort of bad news, it seems to me, is kind of we're on our own here, and that's why David is absolutely right to bring up to say that we need this new generation of critical thinking, and we need to protect the elderly as well. I mean, blimey, otherwise we'll all end up doing silly things like voting for Brexit again. And so our thinking does have to change. I don't think it can be the government's job to put things right. I actually think there is a chance that things are moving so fast that if jurisdictions and the law try to keep up, we're more likely to end up with bad laws rather than better outcomes. And that all sounds sort of pretty crummy, but it seems to me that if there is an answer, instead it will come from inventive communities in tech. So, and the great parallel for me for that is antivirus, which came from smart, inventive people and not from governments. So I think we should be looking less to the rule of law, and I'm praying for the inventiveness of smart people with tech.
I share your concern that many government initiatives in this space are outdated. The EU AI Act, whilst it has laudable goals, may well turn out to be more damaging than what it is trying to solve, because it's too blunt in its analysis, and it will cause many innovations not to happen, which ought to be happening. But I don't think that all politicians are the same in being totally out of touch. Sometimes we have the business people themselves want to spread the story that that politicians are out of touch. And there was this famous time when Mark Zuckerberg was interviewed by members of the US Congress, and day one was awful, because day one typically had the older and more senior people asking very stupid questions indeed. But if you just saw that, you'd think there's no way that these politicians could ever have any good influence. But day two tended to be the younger, more junior members of Congress, and they actually had a lot of good and important points that they made. And I stereotype it a bit, because some of the older people actually had good points too, and some of the younger people were a bit more foolish. But there is a differentiation. And so I think that politicians can be part of the solution, but I share your view that many of the solutions will come to start off with from inventive communities in technology, but some of these communities may well say, we've agreed on something, now we want it to be put into law as a legally binding standard, not just a best effort standard, because it's going to need the force of the law behind it to ensure that everybody conforms. So I look at a joint effort here, with technologists having a lot of leading role, but working in partnership with the right kind of politicians. And I don't write them all off. I know that in TV they can often be seen at Prime Minister's question times and on similar things in other countries as being awful. But when you see them in the committee rooms and when you talk to them one-on-one, actually sometimes they're quite thoughtful and quite knowledgeable.
Also, when they've left politics, isn't it incredible how much sense they make then? Okay, exactly. So I think we've got Chris on again, and Shalini's coming in as well.
Well, let Shalini go on. Thanks.
Shalini?
Sure. I think Ian had a good point. We can actually blockchain all of this. Obviously, we look at environment factor in terms of cost of energy, but if energy costs come down, blockchaining everything from the source will actually tell us it's AI fake or not. I think that's a great idea, and Ian, maybe we should work on that. The second thing on reputation, Ian, it's already been done. Yelp and everybody does exactly that. Uber, Yelp, all of them actually work on that. So I think, and I agree, with the earlier speaker who said we want to be anonymous. And I work a lot in the metaverse. And I think that is a big draw for people because of societal pressures. So we should allow that to happen. So those are my couple of points.
That's it. Can I just pick you up on something there, Shalini? You said you work a lot in the metaverse. Are you seeing, do you think fake media is an issue in that environment? Or are you seeing anything where that's the case?
I think it's like we're going to a Halloween party, or I don't know, whatever parties you'll have in Europe. You are wearing a mask. You are by definition not who you are. So we know that in advance. Correct? So I'm seeing everybody has avatars. I mean, I teach in the metaverse, So my classes, all my students have to show their real faces, and we have ways around that too, because we as consumers are asking the tech to not provide fakes because we won't use their products, and they're responding with it.
Yeah.
So back to your earlier point, David, if you ask and you're willing to, give some kind of monetary benefit to the companies, they'll respond. I mean, finally, they all work for money. So if you say, hey, I'm willing to give that extra money so that you get, true feeds rather than, fake feeds, or give me a feed, but just market AI or not AI, or show me the blockchain thing. I think companies will respond. They've done it throughout society.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Celine just hit on what I was going to talk about, really, which was, we've seen efforts online to try to provide truthful information, factcheck.org and so on, but often they are ridiculed and pillared by the extremes on the internet, and they don't get the traction they deserve. So there are solutions out there to try to tell you that this is the truth. The problem is they don't get the traction, and then it comes down to how do you bootstrap this process and monetary value of truth, and is there a way to provide some compensation, incentivize, and not only within the public, perhaps via education, which I think we've already mentioned, but also providing some mechanism of boosting this, some monetary value for telling the truth, for providing a source of reliable information. If there was some way to do that with the existing tech solutions that we have today, it might really propagate the whole thing forward. But right now it's kind of stuck in this quandary of truth is kind of important, but we can get away without it. And we're in this soup of disinformation and information, and some of it's good. And the laziness people have, and trying to get over this lack of impetus to move to the next step.
I think there is. I think Ian hit upon a good solution. Ian, you should be a multi-billionaire. Just implement it and it'll happen. The Web3, the blockchain can actually make this a reality very easily without too much effort. So
I don't think
go ahead.
I don't think it's incredibly easy. Otherwise, people would have done it before. I think many people have looked at it and haven't quite managed it. But I certainly want to encourage more people looking at it. And I like the spin that two of you have put on my earlier notion that companies should be fined for telling the untruths. You have put it more positively. You said that companies should be financially rewarded for telling the truth. And maybe that is a more effective angle on this.
I think, David, the reason people haven't done it with blockchain and Web3 is, first of all, because there's finite resources in the world, even mental or physical resources, and crypto was the way to go. Now, hopefully, with FTX, people will start looking at blockchain as a much more serious. I think it's a very powerful tool. And again, there was no incentives. Humans don't work without incentives. So if there are incentives and technology is getting cheaper, with the Ethereum doing the proof of stake instead of proof of work, it'll become energy less intensive. I think it'll happen. You'll be surprised. And Ian's going to lead the way, right, Ian?
I'm not putting myself forward to lead this. What lead things? What I am hearing, what I'm finding, is that we're probably looking at a multi-stream future, a multi-stream reality, with a hierarchy of information. And I think at the top, the gold standard hierarchy could very well have some kind of source stamping on it, so we know where it's come from or who hands it's been through. But then you come right down through the hierarchy of kind of hearsay and freedom of speech down to anonymity. And I absolutely get the point that there are times when people wish to be anonymous, either because they need to for mental health reasons or whatever, or they simply want to. They want to go and play games, or they want to look at illicit material, or whatever it is that they want to go and do, and they don't want to be stamped. So I get the point that maybe we don't want to stamp everything, but maybe there's a hierarchy of information, which would also help with rapid debunking. So that if somebody held up a piece of media material and said, "Look at this thing that the Donald Trump or somebody has said. Isn't it awful? It's par for the course," and are using it for to make some kind of point. If that media file is very low on the hierarchy of truth, it's anonymous or we can't verify the source, immediately, because of the general understanding, that has less weight than if it comes from a verified source area. So maybe the whole thing is a little more nuanced than my original thoughts of tagging everything. But I certainly get the points that other people have made, and they're very powerful and need to be factored.
Right, and it could be we as society can decide this is important to be put on the blockchain and this is not. So we'll obviously everything cannot be put because it's an effort and energy, and I think societies will evolve to that. Anyway, I think
Nicolina, I'm conscious that Nicolina's been sitting there for a little while. So Nicolina.
Yes, thank you, Matt. I have been interested to find out how many articles, images, and content we are producing daily right now. So the conversation as one of the let's say reputable sources says that on daily basis we have 3.2 billion images and 70,000 hours of video produced and published daily. So solution that would tackle the amount of content that people will consume before it gets to the first content consumer needs to be super fast, or people need to be aware of the fact that the video they are watching as a part of the morning news perhaps may have been altered or not fully truthful, depending also on the type of media they are watching. For example, there is a version of Nancy Pelosi video that Democrat media shows, in which she speaks with a normal speed and fully understandable. And there is also a version that the conservative media in the United States published, which is slowed down and makes her sound slow, and her speech is slurred and blurry, and she sounds like she is drunk. And we are talking about billions of images and hours of content. So the scale is becoming huge. And solutions like blockchain are something that could be viable, but not completely reliable, if I can say it like that. In my opinion, of course.
Thank you, Nicolina. David.
So this has been a great conversation. I have learned a lot. I have given myself a lot of things to look more fully into. Nicolina, you've raised some very important points about the scale of the problem here. There is so much data being created, and it is created so quickly, and this poses problems for ideas of using the blockchain to somehow be the solution to this. Because, I mean, blockchain is already slow, and you obviously can't put all the content on the blockchain, but you have to put some fingerprints of it. You have to put some summaries of it. And so I think there are hard problems to be solved there. And as it happens, there are companies who are looking at this a bit. I should mention SingularityNet, which you can find at singularitynet.io. And full disclosure, I give them advice from time to time. I sit on some of their advisory boards. They are looking at different reputation management systems. They are looking at how AI can truly be decentralized, that is, operate for the common good rather than being centrally controlled. They are looking at alternative blockchains, not just the one from Ethereum, also the one by Cardano. They are aware of some of the scaling issues and the speed issues and the computational resource issues, and they have some quite interesting suggestions. So maybe they will come along and help other organizations to become the trustworthy providers of information. Which takes me back to what I was saying near the beginning, that perhaps in the 2020s, the winning organizations and companies will be the ones that can be most trustworthy. But a revision to what I said then is that maybe society has to find ways to incentivize these companies to change over rather than just hoping they're going to make that change and hoping they will discover commercial benefit in due course. Maybe there has to be some incentives beforehand. Maybe we've got, as a society, to come up with prizes, or philanthropists can come up with prizes, or in other ways there can be money made available to incentivize finding these solutions more quickly before we just have to wait for the normal slow speed of innovation to come up with solutions to these very hard problems. So these are some of my concluding remarks. They're not as clearly thought out as I would like, but hey, this is a complicated issue, and I thank again all the participants for what they have said. Matt, back to you.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, the real takeaway from me is what Nicolina said about scale, and I just don't think it's something that can be managed at a human scale. It seems obvious that we need technology in order to manage the challenge. So that's the real takeaway for me.
But humans must still have oversight of the technology. Otherwise, we will find ourselves losing our ability to discriminate. The more that we rely on technology to make our hard decisions for us, the less we'll be able to think these things through ourselves. So humans must remain in the loop, if not for every decision, then at least reviewing the processes and the categories of decisions.
Certainly moderation, yeah.
Getting a few thumbs up, which is good to see.
All right.
We should organize other events like this. Let us know what topics you would like to see studied next, and we may be able to set something up.
Yeah, perhaps drop it in the comments here, actually. If you drop it into the comments box, any feedback, what you liked, what you didn't like, as David said, any other topics you'd like to see, and at least then we'll have it all in one place.
Where is the comments box? I can find it.
On the left-hand side, underneath join, you've got details and then comments next to it.
Okay, let me check. And Ian, if you start something, we are all getting a 10% stake in it because you thought of the idea here, okay? We're all co-parts. Thank you, David and Matt.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone.